So I see that it's 11 o'clock. We should get started. Welcome everybody to That Could Work, How to Improve and Tailor Your Workflow. And welcome to the first panel presentation after yesterday's lightning session of National Museum Publishing Seminar 2020, the new virtual incarnation. Thanks to Nikki and the University of Chicago Graham School for hosting this. So if you were paying attention to your program, you would have seen that Camila Foreman from DIA was supposed to be the moderator of this panel. She had a family emergency and needed to step away. So I'm attempting to fill her shoes. My thoughts are with her. I think that's all of the prologue we need, and we can just dive in. So I will turn it over to Nikki to begin our pre-recorded video. Let me issue one sort of caveat or apology. We're book publishers, not video editors, and our pre-recorded session is maybe a little bit lower resolution than we wanted, but it's mostly legible, and anybody who needs to dive into pixel perfect detail on our slide decks, they will be available for download. So I believe that's it.
Hello again, and welcome to That Could Work, How to Improve and Tailor Your Workflow. Again, my name is Camila Foreman. I'm the Director of Publications at DIA Art Foundation, and I'm joined in this panel come webinar by an order of their presentations, Robert Weisberg, Senior Projects Manager at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Matt Mayerchuk, Principal of Mayerchuk and Company, and Joseph Mohan, Director of Production at the Art Institute of Chicago. When we first conceived this presentation last fall, we hoped to ask a set of questions for attendees to sort of take home and apply in light of the specificities of each institution. We wanted to move beyond ideas of productivity and efficiency and really address the human element and sort of inspire you to be more collegial, collaborative, and bring out the best in your teams. The goal with workflow, as always, is to establish a consistent set of linked practices so that you are not constantly reinventing how you're going to work, and you spend less time thinking about what to do or how to do and just doing it. It frees us to be the professionals that we are as editors, production managers, rights and reproductions, personnel, digital media specialists, typesetters, designers, what have you. In light of COVID, however, this panel is going to focus more on the opportunities that this moment has given us, as well as practical tips, since our current working practices are definitely here for the medium term and may end up changing how we work for good. And before I introduce each speaker, I just want to emphasize that our goal here today is to be relevant to institutions large and small. So some parts of our presentations may seem like common sense, but no matter your organization, common sense is often thwarted by sort of institutional history, inertia, seniority, or how power is distributed, personality quirks, or some other reason. So first, Rob will speak about navigating different home office setups and how to unite team members across our now multi-locational workplaces. Next, I'm going to talk about communication, tracking projects, as well as the peculiar thing that many of us experienced this spring, scheduling with no end in sight. So as many of you probably have noticed, the editorial workflow really hasn't changed that much. So I'm going to try to clean up mid-session and kind of introduce vestigial parts of our earlier presentation that still are somewhat relevant. After that, Matt's going to talk about how material really moves through different roles and also introduce, perhaps to some of you, Adobe PDF markup. Joseph will round things out with the surprising ways that production work can be revolutionized. So Rob, over to you now.
Thank you, Camila. Hold on one second, unfortunately. Thank you, Camila. Hello all, I'm Rob Weisberg, Senior Project Manager in the Publications Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm calling my section the Hybrid Workplace of the Now. Because whatever we thought we knew about remote work from museums and publishing, whatever we're trying to prepare for as our institutions start to reopen, the hybrid workplace is already here. I've had some responsibility for workflows and workplace technology for about 26 years, and most of what I've learned has been about serving people, not about technology. We're not only dealing with a mix of home and work tech, but a mix of lived situations and experiences, schedules and systems, pressures and stresses, joys and griefs. So this list was sent out to employees and contractors by the Canadian federal government and reprinted by the website Corporate Rebels. And I think it's great. We are not working from home. We are at home during a crisis trying to work. For me, numbers 4 and 5 are the most important. You will be kind and not judge. If you didn't think that workflows were all about kindness and non-judgmental behavior, I hope to convince you otherwise over the next 10 minutes. So welcome to the Chimera workplace. Instead of a mythological combination of a lion, goat, and dragon, we have a combination of in-office, in-museum, but not at desk, home, and various workstation experiments, as institutions try to carve out socially distanced offices and conference rooms from shared, open, and closed spaces. The only thing we can be sure of is that the new normal is going to be no normal. I think it's helpful to think of the 5 W's. We're not sure of the what about our workspaces and institutions. We'll have no way to predict the when, not just reopening, but perhaps staying open, or the where, maybe not even the who, as any one of us can have to put down our work at any time to tend to ourselves or family. And the how, forget about that. Which to me leaves the why. We have workflows so that our teams can do their best work and our audiences can have their best experience with our publications and our labels. We don't do the tech or the processes or the systems for their own sake. During COVID, the why means helping our colleagues cope with difficult situations, especially as the virus forces us to adjust our workdays and workplaces. For the past 10 years, I've been studying organizational design as it relates to museums. And the term to me, which best describes the present moment, is the acronym VUCA, for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I first read about VUCA in the book Team of Teams by former General Stanley McChrystal, as well as the book Smart Collaboration by Heidi K. Gardner, who's a fellow and lecturer at Harvard Law School. Situations which are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous are all things that museums can be really terrible at. I don't mean in the quality of our labels or our publications. We're experts at making difficult relationships clear and making hard to reproduce images look beautiful in print. But why are museums so bad at VUCA? In my opinion, it's because museums and the people who work there identify so strongly with expertise. Admitting you don't know something is uncomfortable in museum spaces. One thing we know about the coronavirus is that there's still so much we don't know and won't know. This is especially true as museums start drawing up reopening plans. Uncertainty about our working situations is here to stay. Now, before we criticize working remotely, we should ask about the golden age of working together in offices 5 days a week. What negatives about working in an office are we simply replicating through technology? Are we tied up all day in virtual meetings? Maybe we had too many agendaless meetings in our offices where we were just talking over each other. Or try sharing a Google Doc during a virtual meeting, which couldn't be done in person. Loneliness in workplaces is also real. Are we drowning in email at home? Then we probably were at the office too. Is our day filled with distractions? Offices are as well. Are we trying and failing to balance work and family or just life? This happened all the time before the middle of March. Keep in mind also that accessibility advocates have been asking for greater work accommodations for years. I'm not pretending that things are less difficult at home for everyone, only that we should ask tough questions about our office workflows. This might be an opportunity to do away with some practices we assumed were necessary, like sprawling meetings where no decisions got made, or back-to-back meetings, or infinite email threads. We should take more time away from our desks, not from distraction, but with intention. So we all know the basic tech that we need to work at home: computer, monitor, printer, etc. And now many of us know the advanced technology better: VPN, antivirus and security software, screen sharing, even ergonomics. We need the right tech, whether or not our institutions are able to provide assistance in setting up at home. But I also want you to think about the environments and the surroundings beyond the technology, and not just our physical surroundings, but our emotional surroundings as well. Quiet, not just from family, but from workflows. Focus and recharging, which is the key to resilience. Some of us have had these in our offices, and some of us, we had to leave our offices to have any of these, such as taking regular breaks from a screen. We should commit to tackling each of these lists as we design our workflows. A computer isn't much good if there's no quiet place or time to use them. So the less you rely on a single tech which must work at else, the better. Being an expert on Zoom or Excel won't help you when everyone else in your team is using Teams or Google Sheets. Be curious. There's never been a better time to know multiple programs. You may have to work with your institution's preferred system, but you can maintain some flexibility and some backup plans. And forcing others to use your solution or else is only going to contribute to people's stress, which is the worst thing you can do when designing a workflow. If you have to use your own software and you found something that you like, keep using it. Tell others, maybe it can help them as well. Remember what happens to every piece of hardware and software you've ever used, good or bad. It all ends up in the trash. I feel like I've spent the time working from home unlearning a lot of things that I'd sworn by. That one perfect technology, and also that one perfect practice. Best practices and perfectionism, especially during times of crisis, can reinforce systems of oppression and exclude people who might be marginalized in your workflow or struggling with family or job security or housing. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't have rules of thumb or guides or teach each other good ways to work, just as my partners in this presentation will be doing shortly. I just mean that this is the worst time to throw down about that one way of doing something. Being flexible will serve you better right now and teach you lots of useful lessons for the future. Also, don't go in on a single method of communication. Never mind which video conferencing tool you use. Be open to how you and others prefer to communicate, whether it's email, chat, video, shared documents which people add to when they have time, or even a good old-fashioned phone call. Remember that there are introverts and extroverts, and many people can be one or the other at specific times of the day, in specific situations. You may need to respect that someone can't have an effective meeting in the morning, or does their best work in the evening because of family responsibilities. You should welcome and respect boundaries, monitor implicit biases and structural unfairness, and adjust expectations for participation. It may seem like I've opened the doors to complete chaos. No best practices, no set technologies, no preferred workflows. But here's where you can gain back some control, and it starts with writing everything down. Get all of your office tech, processes, and systems out of your head and into a guide, and not just for yourself, but for your colleagues. It should be shareable and easy to update. Have at least 3 ways to get anything done. You can also record learnings about special situations, such as the one we're in right now. Remember, this is for learning, not recording for its own sake. It's also a good chance for you to find out the work that other people do on your team, in your department, and in your institution. If you make a guide and people aren't using it, figure out why, and don't be judgmental. Remember preferences. That emailed PDF might not work for everyone. So here's an example of a department user's guide, which I started in my department about 5 years ago with the help of our department administrator. I've maintained it with succeeding department administrators, and now we have 55 pages of technologies, instructions, learnings about everything, from our conference room to our department laptops, to tips and tricks in dealing with IT and using InDesign and other programs. It's not about the work of individual teams or people. That's up to individuals to share. And it's as much for me as for colleagues. I consult it constantly so that I don't have to keep every tech solution in my head at all times. I update the guide with important instructions from IT, as well as any shortcuts from our colleagues. I recirculate it once or twice a year as a PDF and a shared link. Getting everyone to use it is a challenge, but that encourages me to think of new ways to make shared knowledge easy to access in a way that respects my colleagues' schedules and our team's priorities. Now, this is something I haven't tried yet, but I'm going to give it a go. It's a personalized version of a user's guide, which I found on the website of the productivity software company Atlassian, who makes Jira, Confluence, and Trello. Some of it can get pretty deep and a bit new agey, but if you think about the information you're already sharing with your colleagues, it does make a lot of sense. These kind of personal guides can be especially useful during a hybrid workflow, when no one can take for granted their colleagues' availability, communication preferences, bad days, and not quite as bad days. You can note ideal hours for contact, your best style of learning and absorbing information, and what impacts your own motivation and productivity, and decide what you want to share with colleagues. One of my favorite experiences in the office is being able to teach classes to colleagues, like I did last year with InDesign for my department. I've also taught InDesign to teams in other departments. I learn as much from these classes as from my colleagues, since they provide practical insight about how they use the technology in practice. And you can bet I add all of these to the user's guide. Teaching also helps build bridges between silos for teams and departments and even institutions. I don't want to diminish the importance of our institutions providing professional development opportunities, or to claim that we can teach each other everything, paging Dr. Fauci. But creating a preference to sharing can help our entire organization learn. So you've written everything down, you've learned people's preferences and working styles. You've made guides for yourself and for your workflow, you've taught and you've learned. So what now? The answer is test. Regular testing and learning, then sharing what you found out, is the key to evolving and improving workflows. If you pass this knowledge along to others, you can have them help you to co-create your workflows, so it's not all on you. Perhaps even starting with bugbears such as version control. Remember earlier when I showed you those 6 principles of remote workflows? This is where kindness and being non-judgmental really come in. Testing with your colleagues gives you a chance to be kind as you see what works and what doesn't. And be kind to yourself. No perfectionism, no always being right. Be kind to your colleagues, especially those who are struggling. It's easy to say, let's be ready for the next crisis, but the virus doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Structural racism and climate change are already here. We're not returning to normal, whatever that actually was. We can go somewhere better. Hopefully, I've outlined some steps you can take to teach yourself, teach others, and be more ready to build a kinder, better, and more open workflow. And on that note, here's some contact information from me. I look forward to answering any questions now or later. And please, if you figure out anything, let me know. I'll be sure to write it down. And now back to Camila, who will talk about workflow from an editorial perspective.
Thank you, Rob. That was really insightful. So before I get into COVID-related concerns, I just want to briefly address the other hot button issue, at least in the United States. Many museums are thinking critically about equity and inclusion right now, and I think there is a critical question that we can also ask in terms of workflow, and that is, how do you build your teams? Even if you're working at a very small institution, I think these are valid questions to ask, particularly if you rely on contract labor, or even at a much smaller scale of how you delegate tasks for an individual project. So when it comes to sort of the best projects, right, the most interesting ones, the most complex ones that offer great opportunities for professional development, or the highest profile projects, are we just defaulting to seniority? And if we're doing that, have we considered that Seniority might just be the last person who, for whatever reason, is able to consistently work in this field that is filled with low wage labor. And if we do continue to default to seniority, are we making sure that we're taking time to really develop the skills of our less experienced colleagues and giving them reasons to keep working in this industry? When we're designing teams, do we think about as well what I would argue are hard to quantify harder skills of editing and color correcting? Obviously it's very important, but I put those terms in scare quotes because, at least speaking for myself, once I got to a certain point in my career, I gave the same joke at every single annual review, which was, this year I've edited harder than I've ever edited before. You know, the way we judge people is often extremely subjective and is highly subject as well to implicit biases. So are we keeping that in mind? Or when we're building teams, are we thinking about other skills that might be really relevant for a project? For example, when you're working with a notoriously cantankerous person in another department, do we privilege temperament and affability, speed, flexibility, transparency, the type of coworkers that we all know who are really accountable to themselves and really are accountable to their colleagues? I find for some people, equity is sort of sadly a newfound obligation, and inclusion is atonement for past blindnesses. But equity and inclusion are also opportunities to really assess the people around you three-dimensionally, consider what each person brings to the table, and find ways to kind of build complementary teams with skill sets that really come together kind of in the round. And I think this is important to think about because often that's actually what's best for the project. But more than just being really good for whatever the final product will be, it's also good for the people who are working together. So moving on, let's talk about communication. So as Matt has eloquently put it to me before, everybody talk to everybody. Video eliminates the space constraints for, say, how many people can fit in a conference room or the cost of traveling. So there really is no excuse not to get everyone together at the start of a project, including part-time staff and freelancers. And it's also a chance to sort of fix any previous gaps in communication, because for many of us, there's that one person in our department who, for whatever reason, that person's role, lack of seniority, is sort of the last person to know things. Here's your chance to get them in the room or the virtual room earlier and more often. So how does this play out in practice? First off, if you don't have kickoff meetings, you should. It's a way to sort of get everyone together to really understand the complexities of whatever you're working on. So, you know, is text being edited by multiple people and maybe one of those people is in-house and someone else is out of house? Will the material be produced in batches, and how will those batches be determined? If it's a digital project, are you using a new platform or modifying an existing platform, and how much development time will be needed to do that? And how will all of these questions and more impact every single person on the team? In addition to reviewing all parts of the process, hopefully Rob's presentation has made clear that this is a great chance for you to figure out who's more comfortable working in certain ways and who's a little bit more flexible. I think these are good questions to ask, particularly as right now, many of us are being asked to do more than one job, more than what's already pretty normal in our field, and we've always relied on freelance labor, so getting everyone to kind of understand how we'll come together makes things so much easier later down the road. They're also helpful when you offer sort of a brief about the material that's being published, given by the content lead or the curator. We tend to glean piecemeal knowledge about the subject through whatever we're working on. So an editor through the text, image acquisitions through working on the figure lists and the like. So having some sort of kickoff meeting, we can talk about really what the subject matter is, establishes sort of a base level of knowledge and reduces the need for what is pretty common, where the editor ends up being the in-department expert on the material, which, by the way, is more work for the editor, but it also reinforces certain hierarchies that are endemic to many departments. So how do you keep this open communication style going, throughout the life of a project? Well, one thing, you should always be listening up and down the chain. Never assume that you know what other people are doing or what they need. Always ask and make clear what your needs are as well. Many of us get really caught up and are much more focused on the constituents who matter to us. For example, as an editor, the author-editor relationship, we don't really know what the person in the virtual cubicle or office next to us really does. So some good questions to ask are, Do you know what everyone on your team does? How long it takes them to do it? Their preferred way of working and why, who they need to talk to get their work done, and perhaps most importantly, what you can do to support them. You should also maintain consistent, regular contact among the working group. And I know some people listening to this are probably rolling their eyes or saying, duh, but even in the best run institutions, and I'm on my 4th museum at this point, we can be very good about best practices for certain projects, for books, for labels, certain digital projects. But there's plenty of work that we do that falls between those different silos where we're not as good at maintaining best practices. So I think this is important to just sort of remind ourselves. In maintaining consistent, regular contact, it's more than just sort of when you go over the content list or the schedule, making sure that everyone sort of knows where you are in the process, who's actively working on it, but it's also a great chance to sort of triage the big problems because every project has some big problem at some point. And when you're meeting regularly and going over the schedule and the TOC or the book map or what have you, make sure that you are, when you get into the minutia, clearly assigning tasks, designating names, initials, due dates. I happen to be a big fan of just using plain old Word docs. And when a deadline is missed, I just deploy a straight through. So instead of reissuing a new schedule every single week or what have you. And the idea of doing that is to sort of encourage public accountability. And speaking of accountability, no matter how you track things, make sure you share these documents in a public place. There's not really enough time to go through folder structures or file naming conventions, but I think the main point for people who are managing projects is that it's a good idea to sort of train people that they can always figure out what's going on with your work if you point them to a live document that lives in the cloud or on a server. And if you build these documents well, you can use them to help you with maintaining a schedule or managing a budget. So, keep having a combined kind of TOC schedule to keep track of the schedule, or using a book map to keep up with the number and sizes of images so you can keep up on your separations costs. So now I'm going to go back and talk about that peculiar situation that happened back in the spring. And I think it's still relevant because of the possibility of a second wave, no matter where you are in the globe, and the increasing likelihood of rolling lockdowns across the United States for months. So let's talk about schedules with no end in sight. So one of the things I think we all kind of gleaned back in March and April is that the text process is relatively stable. Authors can still write if they have access to most of their research material, and editors can continue editing. But what gets tricky is how you deal with certain images, particularly if you need new photography or you need to scan or digitize things. So it's wise to try to figure out ways to decouple image from text, whether that's going back to authors and asking them for more images or substitute images, encouraging them, particularly if they work for large museums or universities, to use material from their own repositories, and hopefully you get a discount on those reproduction costs or they're free. Or in another cost-saving measure, pointing people to image houses that use Creative Commons licenses. Another thing to do is review text in galleys. So I'm sure some colleagues on this call may have no idea what I'm talking about. Galleys are typeset text without images. And so the idea here is if the images or design is being held up in some way, you can continue reviewing the text, clean it up further, and get it closer to a publishable state. When I talk to designer friends, some of them would actually be really happy we reincorporated this into our processes, because I think we've all experienced this. There's always a surprising number of corrections in the first round of review. And so this is a way to sort of really clean up your text so that when you really are reviewing with the images, you're not having to redesign things because the text is radically reflowed. And I also think this is important in this particular moment because fact checking is very touch and go. Curators don't have access to all their material, authors don't have access to all of their material, and we're just sort of getting dates and names and little things and drips and drabs, and so this just gets things cleaner and easier further along in the process. Another thing to do is to at least tentatively book major meetings or reviews. Many of us have to do this anyway because we have really busy department heads or directors, but for this particular issue, it's useful, and this is just sort of speaking for myself, as a psychological anchor. Back in the endless forever month that was April, when I was doing exactly what I'm doing right now, working in this little rectangle inside this box of an apartment, having a set design review, like made me realize just how much my work mattered, that there were other people waiting for stuff, and that there was something to sort of look forward to. It can also be sort of a negative motivator in the sense of, well, this really needs to get done by this specific date, because if we reschedule this meeting, we're not going to get approvals until much farther along, and it puts the whole project into jeopardy. Another thing that you can do, and this really only works, or it's more likely to work earlier in the process, but surprisingly it's possible. See if you can renegotiate your author deadlines. You know, for many institutions, a curator's show has been pushed back for 3 years, so now that person actually has time to write for your book or for your digital project. I've actually seen this with 2 projects at DIA, one with the curator and one with the professor at a major research institution. And the reason why I know that this opportunity is available is because, you know, I went and asked and listened up and down the chain. And then the last thing I want to say is just to sort of piggyback on a lot of what Rob mentioned, which is we're all human here. And so when you get an end in sight, and it's a good idea to make sure you're squirreling away little pockets of time. Our schedules have never been padded. That is a lie that people say about us. Instead, they actually reflect the amount of time it takes real human beings to do their work at the highest quality level, considering all of their responsibilities, whether professional or personal, and their own priorities. And now is the time, really especially, to remember that we're all human. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to one of my favorite humans, Matt.
Thank you, Camila. Let me get my screen sharing. Hang on a second. Okay, so I'm Matt Mayerchak. I run my own business doing book design and layout, and I primarily work as a typesetter and production artist on long documents, including several museum books every year. I'm going to focus on the workflow between the production manager, editor, book designer, and typesetter. I know a lot of designers set their own type, so some of these steps can be combined for them. The first thing I'd like to do is to reiterate what Camila said, that everybody should communicate at the earliest possible stage. You won't believe how many times people have called me up to say they'd like me to work on a book, and it's already written, copy edited, designed, and they're ready for me to set the type. At this point, it's really too late for me to make any workflow suggestions. For instance, on one book, the manuscript was very complicated with lots of text that was quoted from legal documents. Fortunately, the author had inserted style tags in angle brackets at the start of each paragraph for body text, legal quotes, A-heads, and so forth. This is a perfectly good system. I can use fine change to replace those tags with a paragraph style. But the editor thought that this would slow me down, so they removed these tags and put them in track changes, which I could not import into InDesign. So they wasted a lot of their own time, making my job harder because it just never occurred to them to ask me. So as soon as a museum or designer calls to hire me, I ask, who's the editor? When can we meet? Can we talk about manuscript prep? And have they ever done digital markup? One step that always seems way too cumbersome is how to convey the images to the designer. You may have images coming from different sources with different file naming conventions or rights limitations, and you really need a way to communicate all of this information that makes sense for everybody that's going to work with it. I've had people send me spreadsheets with thumbnail images in each row, but when I'm doing layouts, I don't find those easy to work with. So this slide shows a few pages of a file that Chris Zachello from the Met provided to the book designer. We've included a PDF of this document in the folder for you to download. Chris places the image into an InDesign file along with the image details and instructions such as large, small, full bleed, silo, and so forth. Having it in InDesign means that the designer can just copy and paste them into their layouts, and they don't need to worry about, do I have the right scan? There's far less time spent trying to keep the image file names straight. The production manager doesn't need to worry about sizing or cropping the images. They can just place them rough. I know there's other methods that people have come up with, but the main thing is to have a system that works equally well for both the production manager and the designer. The book designers that I work with typically create 50 to 75 pages of sample layouts showing every different kind of page and design element. This is a sample from a book on Hokusai's landscapes that Susan Marsh designed for the MFA in Boston, and you can download it as a PDF. Ideally, the designer should get a draft of the full manuscript so that they can accommodate everything that the book will include. There are always a few pieces of front and back matter that haven't been written yet, but the designer should at least have an idea of what all of these things are and what kinds of information they need to account for. The choice of typeface will be heavily influenced by the subject, but also by the technical requirements of the text. Some typefaces have a lot larger character sets than others, so if you're going to use a lot of foreign words that require special characters, or small caps, fractions, superior figures, all of these things will impact the choice of typeface. You need to know the longest and shortest subheads and chapter titles in order to design the running heads and footers and other styles. And it's important to know if the book is going to be translated because different languages take up different amounts of space. The designer needs to take all of that into consideration. Once the design sample has been approved, this sample file is what they send to me to communicate all of the styles we need to create for typesetting. The editor, designer, and typesetter all need to communicate to make sure they're in sync about things like version naming, manuscript prep, and how the markup will be done. I am a big proponent of digital PDF markup, which I will go into in more detail in a minute, but my motivation for this is to reduce the amount of time it takes to do editorial corrections. I've done books where the hand-marked AA edits cost 3 times as much as the initial typesetting. It's the least fun part of the job, and it always comes in on a weekend rush when the book is already way behind schedule. But what bothers me the most about it is that a huge percentage of it could be avoided by proofreading before we did layout, or it could be done so much faster and more accurately using digital markup. So as soon as I hear about a book, I ask the editor if they've tried working this way, and I try to get them to do a test file before they have to mark up hundreds of pages. I also love Camila's suggestion about sending the typeset galleys to a proofreader before it goes into the designer for layout. So many of the edits that we end up doing late in the schedule could have been caught by an early round of proofreading when they were easier and cheaper to fix. The division of labor between the designer and typesetter varies from project to project. Some designers hand off files that are for visual reference only, and I start from scratch, building all the master pages and styles. Others are more production ready, so I can take what they give me and just make a few adjustments. Susie Marsh and I have done over 100 books together, and still for each book, she sends me a list of specs like use a hair space between the fraction and the whole number, use a multiplier for dimensions, use a thin space around em dashes, and so on. These change from book to book based on the typeface and the design, so it's essential to have all of these things spelled out. For each round, the designer sends a PDF to the editors who mark it up and then send it on to me. I do the text edits and do everything I can to keep the layouts from shifting due to the corrections. Then I send the files back to the designer who does the layout revisions, and on we go to the next round. As for whether or not to work with a typesetter, it really depends on how busy you are. If you do one book at a time and have enough time, then it might well make sense to do it yourself. But if your time is limited, a typesetter can set hundreds of pages or wall labels in a fraction of the time that it takes most designers. And that allows them to spend more of their time doing the design work. So digital PDF markup has become a lot hotter of a topic lately due to people working remotely and not having access to large format color printers and scanners. I've created a 7-page little mini manual that you can download, which goes into much greater detail than I have time for here. But basically, digital markup means that the editor does the typing, types the edits directly using the commenting panel in Adobe Acrobat. And if done correctly, the InDesign user can import these edits into their document without having to retype them. There's no handwriting, no trying to figure out whether that's a capital letter or make sense of hand-drawn arrows that crisscross 3 columns of type. At the moment, this is done using PDFs, but Adobe has already started rolling out a feature called Share for Review, which eventually will allow editors to do this in a web browser. Editors I've worked with have been big fans of this workflow. The heavier the markup, the more time it saves, and we can usually cut the turnaround time in half. The editors don't need to buy anything. They can work in the free Adobe Reader or Acrobat Pro. The main thing is that they have to use the specific commenting tools, which are easy to learn. For instance, the sticky notes are fine for general comments, but are not good for text edits because they are not anchored into the text and don't change the text automatically. The first time I worked this way with an editor, I asked them to do a one-page test file, and that helps us to avoid mistakes like deleting word spaces or mistaken assumptions about how this works. Adobe is constantly trying to make all of their tools intuitive, which can sometimes cause problems because what's intuitive for one person is not for someone else. For instance, it's possible in Acrobat to edit a PDF's text directly without using the comments, but those changes can't be imported. I can think of at least 2 occasions where an editor skipped doing the test page because they knew how to use Acrobat and they were sure they could just figure it out. So they edited the entire document by directly changing the PDF's text instead of using comments. When we got the PDF, we had no idea what they had changed, and I did not like having to call and tell them that what they had done was useless and they would have to start over. So when edits are done using the right tools, InDesign has the ability to import them natively. In addition, there is a third-party plugin called Annotations that makes the process much faster. Using annotations, I can accept a whole page of edits at a time. This short video shows how I import the edits into InDesign using the plugin. Here we are in Acrobat with a one-page sample PDF from a book that Camila edited. The commenting panel is open and you can see the text commenting tools at the top. Switching to InDesign, I have the Annotations plugin window open and I import the edits. We have only one page here, but you import the edits for a whole document at the same time, and then you can accept them either individually or a whole page at a time. I check to see that they appear to have come in the right position, and then I accept the edits, and in this plugin, it uses highlighting to show me where all the edits were made. So I can zoom in to see that she included the right amount of word space and so forth, and I can fix anything that didn't come in perfectly, and then I clear out the edits and move on to the next page, so it's much faster than doing it manually. It's also possible to create a PDF comment summary that shows the edits off to the side of the page so the editor can proofread the corrections. The biggest drawback to the digital PDF markup workflow is that the edited PDF must match the InDesign file. The edits are positioned on each page using their XY coordinates, so if the text has been changed at all, the edits may come in the wrong place. One way to handle this is to break the book up into sections. Instead of one 300-page InDesign file, you have 4 or 5 sections so that when one is being edited, the designer can still work on another. Again, this requires close coordination between the designer, the editors, and the typesetter. This workflow shifts some of the text editing away from the designer and back to the editor who has greater subject expertise. This is a good thing as long as the editor is an accurate typist. What you type is what you get. If you use live endnotes or footnotes, the editor has to be careful not to accidentally strike out the note references because that will delete the note text and all of the others will be renumbered. Any text that's part of an image can't be changed automatically, but you can still see the markup and fix it manually. When there are a lot of pages of heavily edited text, which is common in back matter, it's always worth considering whether it would be faster for the typesetter to just reset that section from a clean Word file. If anybody wants to know more about PDF markup, please email me after the Q&A and I'll be happy to go into as much detail as you can stand. In closing, the technology for remote collaboration is rapidly changing and the increase in people working from home will only accelerate that. But none of these tools can do the work. A workflow is only good if it can easily be adopted by people. The more you communicate, the more opportunity you have to share ideas and make sure you all have the best workflow for the people who are actually doing the book. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joseph Mohan from the Art Institute of Chicago, who will give us a production manager's point of view.
Thanks, Matt. So, as Matt just said, my name is Joseph Mohan. I'm the Director of Production in the Publishing Department at the Art Institute of Chicago. When we first conceived of this panel, I was going to talk about how to tailor your production workflow, but given our current climate, I'm going to narrow that down quite a bit and talk about how to produce a book remotely. So, production from afar, the next best thing to being there. At first, this is a pretty shocking idea. You're not going to be near anything that you'd usually be near, whether that's the artwork you're proofing or your sample library of papers and cloths. or the printing press to attend a press check. This all happened quickly. When AIC canceled travel in March, I thought I could argue for an exemption for a press check I had coming up. And a week later, the entire state was locked down. So there's really no question that all of this is necessary and we need to figure out our new ways of working. The reasons for this are pretty obvious. Nobody should really be getting on a plane, even if you're allowed to. You have to ask if it's worth the risk. And as we know, Europe doesn't want visitors from the US right now anyway. And even if it were safe to travel and gather, we have to ask ourselves whether it's worth the money. Everybody's in a different financial situation than they were a few months ago. So maybe press checking a book isn't at the top of your priority list anymore. Besides money, another upside is that not being able to go on press really incentivizes finishing a project properly. If you can't be there to coordinate all those final corrections as you usually might be, that's a pretty good justification to say no to some of the last minute changes that people request at times. Obviously, taking fewer flights is never a bad thing from an environmental angle, and I'll use this as a moment to plug the Green Publishing panel that's coming up on August 6th. But primarily, I'm here to talk about the fact that you can still make a beautiful book without doing it the way you're accustomed to. And I'll also just take a moment to point out that printing a book without being there on press is not a brand new idea. Lots of people do this. It's just that we in the museum field are not very accustomed to it. I was going to start by talking about design, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. There are some things to say, but it's perhaps the part of this process that's least affected by a quarantine. So if you have any questions or you want to talk about this, please follow up in the Q&A or contact me directly, and I'm happy to discuss it. So I'm going to move right on to proofing. This is where things start to change and get a little bit more difficult. So the first thing you should do when you're approaching a project is talk to your photographers. Find out about all of the images you're going to be working with. Find out how recent they are, what sort of issues they might have, just essentially how much can you trust them. Take the information from that conversation into a conversation with your separator and loop in the photographers if it makes sense, and start to make a plan for mitigating whatever those problems might be. So once you're actually sending your files to the separator, everything that was true about this process in pre-COVID times is all the more true now. Whatever decisions you can make up front will simplify things down the line. It will help you reduce the number of rounds of proofs and shipments going back and forth and save you some money. So take some time up front to get clear on how you're going to separate each image, whether it's color or halftone, 4-color black and whites, duotones, etc. Figure out which images have silhouettes or drop shadows. And then there are a number of things that may seem a little bit too early to decide, but you should at least give them some thought. If you know whether you'll be printing on coated or uncoated paper, you can start proofing using the right profile. You may want to start thinking about where you're going to print, whether you're going to be using a Grackle or a Fogra color space, printing UV or conventional, whether you'll use a varnish, things like that. If your book is going to include a big swath of images with similar characteristics, like a backdrop or paper tones, think about that up front. Pick a consistent build to help reduce variability down the line. So now you've probably got some proofs in hand, and I'm guessing you don't have a proofing booth at home. So see what you can do to control your light. A controlled environment is a huge help. One good investment is a light with controllable color temperatures. We use these in the museum for proofing in the gallery. They're about $150 and they're incredibly useful. I mounted mine on a tripod, and then I built a little foam core cube to control reflections and color casts. It's great. If you can't do that, then sunlight is your next best option. But watch out where it's coming from. See if it's reflecting off of a colored wall, either in your apartment or across the street. See if it's filtering through trees. Make sure it's bright and neutral as possible. Then I would say you should be soft proofing to some extent. See if you can get your hands on a monitor calibration tool, even if you don't have a wide gamut monitor. This is helpful to just make sure that you can rely on what you're seeing on screen to some extent. Or if you can't do that, just look at your files, check the metadata, look at how old they are, whether the color targets look right, see what kind of capture system was used, look at the histogram. This is especially useful for anything that came from outside your museum. And of course, sometimes you're not the only one who needs to see the proofs. When you need to agree with somebody else or get sign off, have some duplicate proofs sent to them and then discuss over video or the phone. A duplicate set of an entire book can be expensive, so you might just want to choose images that are most important or that can represent and stand in for the whole. If you're going to be talking about color, again, you should see how your environments compare. Sunlight is going to be the best common denominator, but again, you should talk about weather conditions, cloud cover, how time zone across distances might affect the color you're looking at. That's less important if you're only talking about, say, drop shadows or other edits. If you have a local collaborator, you can do as my colleague Lauren recently did and meet in a park with a proof binder and some hand sanitizer and share that way. Okay, so printing. This is the biggest, scariest one. I'll take a drink of water. Probably goes without saying, but this is not the time to try a new printer, most likely. You should stick with the printer you know and who knows you best. Don't be shy about asking for a preferred press operator if you have one, the one who always knew what you were going to ask for before you came to sign a sheet. Find out who's going to be evaluating and signing your sheets. Ask them to record whatever information you might want to know. You want to make it as predictable as possible. To jump back to the question of proofing for a moment, the printers we work with can print files from other sources really well, but they usually love their own separations most of all, and this might be the time to rely on that confidence. Just think about the trade-offs in your project to see if that might make sense and be a good option for you. To go back to paper stock for a moment, you may want to pick up paper stock with a white point that's as close as possible to the digital proofs you've been reviewing. This just reduces the potential for surprise down the line. Those of us who work in production or those in publishing generally may very well understand how a paper tone can affect color, but some of your outside collaborators may not be as used to that, and you don't want them to be surprised either. Press tests are more crucial than ever. You may want to think about taking some of the money you're saving from a press check and put it toward press testing. First press test I recommend for any book. A second press test is really useful, especially if you won't be on press. It lets you confirm that the adjustments you made from the first test are actually working. As always, you want to make sure to include any unpredictable elements in your press test, such as screens and builds, overprinting, type treatments, that sort of thing. You should press test each stock you're using, especially if you're trying to match images between stocks, like if you have an overall uncoded stock and a detail on an uncoded stock. You want to see how those are going to match and what sort of compromises you might need to make. Also, you may want to include your cover image on the press test and do a lamination test and figure out what kind of adjustments you need to make. Next, you're going to want to make the most of your blue lines process after you upload. A high-res PDF of the ripped file is very useful. It provides a visual check of the high-res art to make sure it's placed and linked. It lets you examine cropping in detail, silhouettes, image edges, and the like. And of course, it's shareable. You can send it to editors and any other collaborators who need to review the final file. Sometimes I've noticed a PDF isn't perfect for extremely fine-grained detail. Sometimes you can't really tell if there's a thin black line on the edge of an image. I've asked for a plate proof from the printer. This is generated by their virtual proofing software, and it allows you to see the actual rosette pattern, just like you would when you're looking under a loop at an actual printed sheet. I found that physical plotters are still necessary. They let you check things like imposition and folding of something complicated like a gatefold. And they let you confirm that what you're seeing on screen is actually translating to paper, things like overprints and blending modes. And finally, you should check your link report. This is generated during the InDesign pre-flight after the file is assembled. You should keep a record of your file names of all of your okayed images. And then make sure that those are actually linked in the file. You can do this with your link report. It lets you see the resolution too. And it lets you make sure that there are no low-res images that you missed in the file that you would be seeing come off press. So you're getting close to actually printing. It's time to make a strategy with your printer. Talk through the process that you follow on press and ask them to follow it. Tell them everything that you'd be thinking about, how you get to the point where you can deem a sheet approofable. Everybody knows basically that you want to match a proof color-wise, but we know that's not always possible. So talk about your qualitative requirements. What are your subjective biases? Maybe you really hate pink color casts and you'd always opt for a green color cast. Maybe you always want to push the black to the higher end of the range. Maybe you know that you'll be working with works on paper where to get the illustration to match, you need to sacrifice the paper tone. Let them know that that's the sort of sacrifice you're willing to make. And then of course, there are some quantitative decisions. What has to match? What's the most important image in the book that must match the proof that you've sent them? A really good tool for organizing your thoughts on this sort of thing is a PDF of the printing imposition. This lets you imagine that you're seeing how the sheets will be arranged as they roll off press. Take this PDF, annotate it with the priorities and the thought process that you can imagine yourself going through if you were there on press looking at this sheet in person. It helps you see where those most important images are, what they're in line with, and what sort of compromises that you would be willing to make on press. It lets you see where the crossovers are, it lets you see where bleed details are that must match overalls. And it lets you see how details may be interacting with crossovers. This can all get a little bit complicated, so don't be shy about being really detailed in your thinking and explanation. Finally, pick a place for them to start. Pick a form with the most representative images or sort of the keystone of the whole project, so they know that they're on good footing from the very beginning. At some point though, you gotta let go and let them print your book. So like I said, know who's standing in your shoes. Ask them to record whatever info is most important to you, whether it's the density of each sheet, the dot gain, a narrative of the compromises that they had to navigate. They should keep the sheets flat until you approve F&Gs. This is a simple thing to request, but very important. In the case that you want to reprint anything, it should be as easy and as economical as possible. And of course, they should send you back the digital proofs with your with your F&Gs, so you can see what happened and those sorts of compromises they dealt with. So finally, some wrap-up thoughts and caveats. I've only printed 2 books during this quarantine, and they were both well underway by the time we all had to retreat to our homes. Our museum is reopening pretty soon, so we should have a little bit more flexibility moving ahead, even though we won't be returning to the office right away. But if we've learned anything from all of this, it's that we shouldn't take anything for granted. If a complete closure went on for a very long time, starting a project from scratch and working through it would prevent some different challenges that we haven't had to navigate quite yet. For instance, what if you're making a book and none of the work has been photographed? That's a question maybe we can address in the next NMPS. I hope we don't have to deal with that. So essentially, whether you're starting a project or examining a final printed book, you just need to adjust your expectations. This calls back to things that all of my co-panelists have been saying. You need to be reasonable. There's no way you're going to get the exact book that you would have gotten under our old circumstances. Maybe you would have made different choices throughout or on press, but you have to accept a little bit of this loss of control. It's an understatement to say that we're living in a new reality and priorities are shifting pretty substantially. So in response to that, we should just be thoughtful and flexible and understanding of ourselves and others. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Camila.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Rob. This has been really great. And I guess we will see each other and the audience after a lovely little time warp. So see you in a sec.
Hi, everybody. I managed to put my computer to sleep just as we were beginning the Q&A session. So thanks everybody who stuck around. The chat was very lively throughout. I kept track of a bunch of the questions that came up, and I'm hoping that either through the chat that went on or information that came out during the course of the video helped to answer some of those questions, but obviously we're happy to try to address as much as we can. As you know, Camilla asked an early question of me about the design portion of my panel that I cut out. And, you know, as I said, it's because, I found that it's the piece of this process that is, maybe the least affected by our new reality. And for us, that's because most of our designers, we work across distances anyway. We do design with our in-house folks sometimes, but for the most part, it's all already happening over email. I'll say that screen sharing is really great when working with a designer because you can see exactly the same thing at the same time and just talk about everything as it arises. I think the hardest part of dealing with design and the galley stages that people are facing right now is not having a printer at home, especially one that can print 11 by 17, which, if you're like the Art Institute, you go through a ream a day. So I've done weird things like measure my monitor a lot and make sure that what I see on screen is the actual size of a piece of paper. I've also cut out pieces of cardboard at a trim size that we're thinking about. So if anybody wants to have a fuller conversation about that, please ask questions or get in touch with me. Let's see, Matt addressed this, but there was a question early on about how institutions incorporate freelancers into their workflows. I'm afraid I didn't record exactly who asked that, but maybe you could pop up in the chat and say whether you feel like this was properly addressed. Danielle, anything to add, or do you feel like we talked about this? And we're still getting used to all of the logistics of this, but we talked about the possibility of letting people or encouraging people to unmute themselves and ask a question live. So if you're comfortable with that, we can give it a shot. How institutions work with freelancers more generally? That's a good question. I mean, we work with freelancers of all kinds, like I just said, designers, obviously, but also proofreaders, indexers, occasionally copy editors. And to highlight a theme of a lot of our panel, the most important thing is communication and getting everybody involved as early as possible. Outline the scope of the project in the contract and keep them updated with book maps and schedules, as things develop. Does that help a little bit? I know you said that, 50% of freelancers in the Netherlands, or excuse me, 50% of creative workforce is freelance. I'm not sure exactly what ours is.
I guess I have a question. Can I add to that? Because I'm the one asking the freelance questions.
Sure.
So, yeah, like I said, a lot of freelancers over here in the cultural sector. I wonder, because I feel like I have very little agency in the institution's workflows. Is there a way to kind of nudge myself into being involved from earlier on in the workflow? Is there a way to suggest that? And how would you frame that to an institution to suggest that maybe the language development and the translation and the copy editing should be incorporated earlier on in the workflow of the institution?
See Matt raising his hand here.
Yeah, hi. So I have had the exact same issue for years as a typesetter. I think I mentioned something in the presentation about sometimes being called in when everything was already done up to my part of the job. And we could have done things in a smarter way if people just understood a little bit more about what everybody else is doing. And I will say that the most successful project I had was one where they had everybody at the kickoff meeting, because it was a very large 2-volume book. And they had 20 of us all together at the museum before even anybody had photographed the artwork. The printer was there from Italy, the designers, production people, editors, copy editors, and we all talked about how we were all going to do our role. And having done that and had it be so effective, all I can say is I'm constantly pressing to tell all of the people, hey, listen, can we talk as soon as possible? I mean, people are, I do a lot of other projects where I'm more involved in sort of late stage production of final PDFs and things. And people are always curious that I would want to talk to the printer about what kind of settings to use. They just don't understand why I would want to do that. It's like, everybody, the idea that, as Camilla said, everybody talk to everybody is just something, I think it's a cultural thing. You just need to keep asking. Every time, the minute you get called into a job, say, who's doing this? Who's doing that? Can we talk about it? And here's why. And this has been part of my, for instance, my push for the PDF markup has been because it saves so much time down the road on the AA edits, and trying to get them to understand that that saves them money and also faster turnaround. Sometimes the money is already being paid to the designer, so it's less of an incentive, but the faster turnaround is. So I'd say just keep looking for ways that you can promote it as something that's going to improve the project.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
There was a lot of chat right toward the end about different tools for scheduling, particularly multiple projects at once. And I saw Rob weighing in pretty heavily. So maybe, Rob, I don't know if there's anything you want to add now.
This goes back to the point I was making about just being agnostic with your tools. I've never had a tool over the last 25 years that I've proposed or were proposed to me that there was always at least a good number, there were always a good number of people who loved it and who hated it and who were willing to go along with it. Usually, I find in museums we have sort of a bias towards not doing something. So if enough people don't like something, it usually doesn't go forward. So I think this is a case where multiple people need to sort of weigh in on it. The more people who have a suggestion, the more people who are willing to try something. But it would be hard for me to sort of suggest a particular tool that's going to work in every instance. I think one thing in my experience was that you can usually find a tool that works for yourself and for a small team and maybe a second team, but it's hard to scale it beyond sort of 2 or 3 teams. So sometimes it takes someone high up in the institution pushing something, but mostly it just takes a lot of sharing of ideas. A lot of good suggestions were coming out during that conversation in the chat window, all sorts of tools. So we might even put a tool list together and get people to sort of weigh in with their experiences, and that might even make some suggestions to people about things to try. But what I would say is expect to try something and expect to have to pivot a few times between different tools.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, we used to be exclusively an Excel department. We did do Basecamp for a while, which worked on some fronts, but not all. Like I said in the chat, we're using Smartsheet right now, which has worked really well. But like I said, there are some caveats. I mean, it's such a powerful system that you can come up with 100 different ways to use it. And my colleague Ben has become such a Smartsheet pro that we really rely on him to keep that system running, and it works well. But I don't think we've ever found a magic bullet that produces that has a really nice dashboard that shows exactly what everybody's workflow or workload is at one time. If anybody knows that exists, I'd love to hear it. Jacob Horn just asked a great question about what we've liked about this, whether it's produced any new processes that we're going to stick to or things that we've enjoyed but aren't going to continue once we go back to normal, whatever that is. Matt or Rob, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I had said earlier that it's going to be a long time, perhaps if never, that we get back to normal the way that we experienced it. If anyone has an institution that's reopening and has seen just the number of steps that people have to, number of behaviors that people have to change to be able to get back to working in an office. I think we still have a long way to go to learn what we like about working as we do now, what we like, what we don't like. But again, I would encourage people to think about things especially like email and especially meetings. I think having so many Zoom meetings back to back has really made clear just how many meetings we have and how many long meetings we have back to back. And I'm hoping that's something that's a grind that we can start to question as we return to offices. So maybe the way that we handle meetings would be one thing to look at and to question.
Hi. In addition, one thing I've found is that there were people who I've been trying to get for years to do, to mark up files digitally, and they've been doing them by hand. We're old school. We just, we're not comfortable using the keyboard that way. But now that they don't have access to large printers and scanners, they decided to give it a try, and they've been happy with it. So I don't think they're going to go back. So that is I think, a long-term change that was forced upon some people, but I could only push so hard as the freelancer. I didn't have any agency, as the other caller said, but sometimes it just needed to be enough things that made it easier than the other way around.
Okay. There's one question about, how the quarantine has affected programming and commissioning freelance work. For us, there hasn't been a magic bullet. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and the situation just keeps changing. So what we've been doing is just keeping in touch with the people who are making decisions and finding out what's up, even if it's just to hear that there's still no word on exactly what's going to happen. And we've had the benefit of working with some very flexible freelancers who are completely amenable to our schedule changes. We now have a pretty solid plan for all of our projects, which of course will depend on our current plan for reopening the museum and that, and it staying open and all of that. So I'm afraid I don't have like a fantastic answer to that, besides just keeping an open line of communication with everybody, which is a real theme of this panel. What else? Miranda asks, how do you keep your teams united, motivated, and excited with all the uncertainty and with all I have to try to deal with from home? Yeah, that's been a real challenge. We've had some fun during this. We have a weekly meeting every Monday just to check in and see how weekends were and talk about things besides work. You have to strike a fine balance because, as I've seen people saying, Zoom fatigue is real, meeting fatigue is real. And when the only way to get together and unwind is also a Zoom meeting, that's difficult. But I see Lauren just said GIFs and Slack, that's fun. And another theme from our panel is just like being understanding. Rob really hit this very eloquently. Like, we're not working from home or at home during a crisis trying to work. And nobody's necessarily going to be doing their most fantastic work right now. We're dealing with a lot of things that we weren't 4 months ago. We're uncovering things that we've been dealing with for a long time, but nobody's paid attention to them. Joan says kindness, that's a good one. What else? Have we covered all of the major themes? We've gone over by about 15 minutes, but I'm happy to see that 170 people have stuck around. yeah, I don't know. What do the rest of you think? Maybe we could wrap this up. And of course, you know how to get in touch with us. And I know there's been a lot of questions about where to find all the resources we've been talking about. So we'll make sure that there's some communication about exactly where all of those things are.
Yeah. And I'll just throw in, one of the advantages of having a conference spread over a few weeks is that we actually do have an opportunity to have some conversations or some sharing of resources ongoing during the length of the conference. So I know Karen has mentioned in the chat about the Google Doc area, but I think we'll start something in there about a resource for shared tools, workflow tools, but I would encourage people to have conversations over the course of the conference, because it is, if there's something that's gained from virtual conferences, that I think is a real opportunity. So I would say, let's keep these conversations going.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Pay attention to the schedule and keep tuning into all of these sessions. And have a good weekend.